Hi everybody, my name's Anna Taylor. I'm a research fellow at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town, and we're talking about the climate emergency in African cities. So the question is, who's driving the agenda? Internationally, the framework for addressing climate change is negotiated by national governments through the mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is informed in part by the international body of science that is assessed and synthesized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short. Goal 13 of the SDGs calls for urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Much of the emphasis globally is on efforts to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, which are driving the changes in the climate. The focus of this mitigation agenda is to remain as close as possible to a 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature increase above pre-industrial levels, which translates to a global goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is accompanied by an adaptation goal to build capacities across the globe to avoid catastrophic losses associated with warming and increased extreme events, including heat waves, droughts, and storms associated with a hotter world. However, slow progress on realizing the international agreements and national commitments has seen local governments and city networks like ICLEI and C40 push for greater bottom-up climate actions and investments, ramping up pressure on and support for city governments and urban businesses to act urgently on climate change. Financing agencies are moving into the climate space, businesses are looking to provide climate-related goods and services, and citizen movements concerned with climate action and climate justice are growing across the continent and globally. The mix and relative influence of these pressures is different in each city and is still largely concentrated in primary and capital cities, with much less traction as yet in secondary cities and rapidly growing towns across Africa. But youth networks are beginning to change this. So what is the call to action? There are growing calls to reduce climate risks, as well as calls, especially among city networks, to seize the climate opportunity, an opportunity to leverage new technologies, new markets, new sources of funding, and new political capital. The argument is that city governments, more so than national governments, are better positioned to be promptly responsive to urgent needs and where they are empowered to act in a more integrated and locally relevant way. Where this is the case, city governments can more effectively promote innovation and influence behavior and consumption patterns. The question is, does the same hold true and can it be realized in most African cities? It's important to recognize that in many African countries, the decentralization of administrative and financial capacities from national government to city government remains stunted, and as a result of minimal devolution of authority from the national to the local level. This hugely constrains what cities can decide and the actions they can take on issues of energy, water, transport, land use, and alike. Many towns and cities across Africa are growing rapidly despite possessing already woefully inadequate infrastructure and services that do not meet the needs of existing residents. Infrastructure and services need to be substantially upgraded and access expanded to meet the ever-growing and evolving needs of African cities. So how can we radically increase energy access and availability to residents and businesses in African cities without increasing greenhouse gas emissions, or in some cases, especially in South Africa, considerably decreasing greenhouse gas emissions? This requires an energy transition unlike any others that cities elsewhere in the world have been through to date. It requires new forms of innovation, not just in the technology domain, but also economic, social, and cultural innovations. At the same time, how can our growing cities be transformed to function well under a range of future climate scenarios? These are likely to include more intense storms and heavy rains, intense heat waves, if they're coastal cities, storm surges around the coast, and the possibility of more prolonged droughts. But we need to do this in a way that's both equitable and sustainable in supplying urban services to all current and future residents. The climate emergency demands that we tackle this as part of the urban development agenda in African cities.